Good evening. So it's time for our afternoon plenary session. And we have with us this afternoon William DiMascio. Mr. DiMascio is the executive director of the Pennsylvania Prison Society, and he's been there since 1998. Before that, he served a number of different jobs, some interesting things. He was a newspaper reporter, an editor, a State House correspondent, and before that he was an officer in the United States Army, served during Vietnam. He's done consulting for a number of correctional systems in the United States, North Carolina, South Carolina, Oklahoma, Oregon, published a book called Seeking Justice. So, and he's been in the field for quite an amount of time now. And I must say, we're very, very lucky in Pennsylvania. Those of you who aren't here, Mr. DiMascio, I think, is one of our treasures in corrections in Pennsylvania. I know you hate to say he's a humble guy. I know you hate to hear that. And I'm sure his family don't think he's a treasure. But we do. We do. Because if you know anything about the Pennsylvania Prison Society, it really is an organization that advocates for inmates in a sincere and a very strident and a positive way, and is effective. Is effective in the legislature, is effective in their media materials, and they really do a nice job. Excuse me. And restorative justice, giving speeches, conferences. They have a daily conference, and a yearly conference. Excuse me. And one of the things they also do is have a prisoner visitor program. Official visitors, is that what the name of them? Official visitor program. In the state of Pennsylvania, by law, every jail and prison has to allow someone from the Pennsylvania Prison Society to enter their prison, to serve as an ombudsman for the inmates. And I know I've done that for 3 years myself in Lackawanna County Jail, and as some of you know, it's a very difficult thing to do in Lackawanna County Jail. Serve as an ombudsman for the inmates. I did it for 3 years before I got a little burnt out on it, but that's a whole other story. But anyway, I really must say that we're very fortunate to have Mr. DiMascio, not just here today, but in our state. And I hope that you people from California to Texas and Ohio, all the places you're from, California, Florida, I hope you have people like Mr. DiMascio too. So it is our pleasure to welcome him to the National Convocation Jail and Prison Ministry, and he's going to be talking to us about community perspectives on justice. Mr. DiMascio.
I'm opening the door here. Oh. Excuse me. Good afternoon, everybody. So this is the hardcore. You've lasted till the bitter end, huh? That's quite an introduction, and I am going to tell my family about that too, because they really need to hear that. Just to continue very briefly with the commercial for the Prison Society, let me just point out that we are the oldest prison reform organization still in existence in the world. We go back to 1787 and are oftentimes called the Quaker group, which is a little bit misleading because while there were a lot of Quakers involved in the early days and in the formation of the Prison Society, oh my God, sorry. The founders of the organization included people like Benjamin Rush, Benjamin Franklin, Bishop White, who was an Episcopal bishop, chaplain to the Continental Congress, and actually served for 40 years as the president, the first president of the Prison Society. So there was a diversity of, I guess, religious beliefs, but there was really a commonality of foundational values that these folks shared. And that's what sort of brought them together. And as Harry said, today we do work in advocacy. We run programs, reentry programs, parenting instruction. We run programs for children of incarcerated parents. And just about anything we can think of that will help prisoners, formerly incarcerated men and women, or their family members. Those are our three targeted groups. And then there's the visitation program. In 1829, I believe it was. I wasn't there then, but I'm told that at that point, the legislature in Pennsylvania passed the Official Visitation of Prisons Act, and in it, it names the governor, the members of the legislature, and the judiciary, and citizens designated by the Pennsylvania Prison Society. And it says any of those folks may call on any prisoner at any state or county correctional facility 7 days a week between the hours of 9 and 5. Very specific and very open. In fact, I've been to conferences where the whole tone and texture of the conference had to do with transparency in our prisons. I think this is a critical issue that we do not pay enough attention to. It's something that we really need to do. There needs to be outside eyes on the inside. We need to know what's going on there. So that's my commercial. We had this year celebrated our 225th anniversary. We just did that. May the 8th actually, that's the actual start date for the Prison Society. And when you think about it, 225 years ago, this country did not have a constitution. Members of the drafting committee were just beginning to arrive in Philadelphia when the Prison Society was founded. Of course, most of the states were not formed at that point. But in this little talk today, what I'd like to do is take us back even further in time, further beyond colonial times in Philadelphia. I'm thinking not of centuries ago, but millennia, back to when the concept of justice first emerged in the minds of men and women. We can do that now. We can go back in time to when humans first crawled out of the swamp, or when Adam and Eve were romping around the Garden of Eden, if you prefer, because of the miracle of the internet and the World Wide Web. We used to measure time in terms of minutes, hours, days, weeks, just as we measure distance in terms of inches and kilometers and miles. But that's changed now, because now we can traverse the entire globe with a keystroke. We can connect with relatives and friends in Europe, Africa, Asia, anywhere in the world in the blink of an eye, or the click of a mouse. The world has surely shrunk, and I want to suggest to you that we use that thinking here this afternoon to sharpen our focus a bit on what we might see as the long evolutionary march of justice. Today, I'd like to look at justice from the point of view of the very distant past to the way it is today, and hopefully we will be able to have some clues about where we might be headed in the future. We'll see justice in the days of death and dismemberment, followed by a time marked by cruelty and isolation. And hopefully it all means that we're heading somewhere towards, and maybe we're heading at a very snail's pace, but somewhere towards civility and compassion. The earliest accounts of justice in the Bible begin with God's punishment of Adam for eating the forbidden fruit. You know, God issued the mega life sentence. Henceforth, man has to earn his keep through the sweat of his brow. No more free rides in paradise. Cain slays Abel, and the punishment is banishment, social death. Go live in the wilds by yourself, fend for yourself. And that was just the beginning. It was all downhill after that. In fact, man seemed determined to take punishment to the most vicious points imaginable. The Romans were noted for crucifixions. In some cases, victims were nailed to the cross. In other cases, they were tied to it. Ironically, it seems the people who were actually tied to the cross seemed to suffer the most. because they were left until they were left to starve. They were left for days and weeks at a time. And so starvation became a cruel end for them. But the Romans also had a special form of execution that they reserved for the most serious crime, and that was for people guilty of patricide, killing the father or grandfather. It was called the cruellius, which is a word that actually describes a large leather sack. The guilty party would be stripped naked, whipped, and then put into a sack along with a dog, a snake, a rooster, and a monkey. Then the sack was sewn shut and thrown into the Tiber River. Just could not get enough of that good punishment stuff there. But our seeming passion to inflict pain continued well into the Middle Ages, when boiling, burning, drawing and quartering, and other forms of torture and execution were widely used. In fact, during the reign of Henry VIII, who, of course, was known for beheading his wives, some 72,000 people were executed by one means or another. By the time the prison society came into being, hanging had become the most commonly used form of execution. But the influence of Cesare Beccaria, the Italian philosopher and politician, was beginning to take hold at that point. In his 1764 book on crimes and punishments, he made the case for proportionality in punishments. That book was published in the United States a few years later in 1773. And in a land where stealing grapes or killing chickens were considered capital offenses, proportionality became an appealing concept to many of the humanists here. As this nation went to war for independence, the concept of individual liberty also became prominent. And nowhere did the concept take hold faster than in Philadelphia, which of course was that hotbed of Quaker opposition to any form of corporal punishment. So it was that the prison society was formed and began advocating for an end to corporal punishment and improved conditions in prisons. And actually, we didn't have prisons as we know them today in those days. What we had were very dank, cold dungeons. They held men, women, and children all together. This was a time when the concept of holding someone against their will, depriving them of their liberty, was emerging as an adequate form of punishment. And I think we have to think about that in the context of the times, because people in this country had just finished fighting a very bloody war with the mightiest nation on earth, a war for independence. Liberty was not something that they took lightly or took for granted as we do today. It was an important matter for them. The term penitentiary actually became known, I guess, largely through the influence of the construction of Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. In fact, Eastern State Penitentiary, which is now, as some of you may know, a museum of sorts and a place where a lot of people like to go on Halloween to get scared and whatnot. But Eastern State was quite a novel facility. The architect, whose name was John Haviland, was a well-known British architect. And there are prisons around the world that have the same model, the same architecture. It's the wheel, the hub with the spokes leading off it, the cell blocks leading off of it. And I've had visitors to the Prison Society from South America who will come in, and I have a little chart on my wall with a sketch of Eastern, and they'll talk about, that looks exactly like the prison in my country. So they were copied. But what was, I think, especially interesting is that Eastern had indoor plumbing when the White House didn't, when it opened in the 1820s. Also had central heating, which the White House did not have. It's because they ran steam pipes underground, and that's what heated. And the cells were designed to be individual cells. Each cell had a window in it so that the person who was being held there could see the divine light shining through. Because this was a facility that was designed so that people could become penitent, could spend their time reading the Bible and doing penance. And they were held in solitary. And the concept did not last as long as a lot of people would have liked, because it started to bring about all of the problems associated with solitary confinement. And it became overcrowded. You know, you build it and they'll come. Became overcrowded, so they had to start double selling. So I want to transition into what we have as a system today, because today the criminal justice system in this country has become so unwieldy and consists of so many conflicting components that it really is easy to lose sight of the big picture and what it is we in society should be expecting it to accomplish. Prisons are overflowing with more men and women and more juveniles than ever before. And as I'm sure you've heard by now, we now have 5% of the world's population in this country and 25% of the world's prisoners. Judges want more discretion in sentencing, but lawmakers want to mandate more the terms of confinement. And it's been proven a number of times that mandatory sentencing has resulted in a disproportionate sentencing of people of color and little, if any, deterrent impact on crime. Capital punishment remains on the books, even as an increasing number of wrongful convictions exposes flaws in the current system. Now, thanks to Professor James Liebman at Columbia and a group of his students at the law school there, we documented the execution of at least one innocent man in Texas. I don't know if you saw it, but it just came out, I believe, a week or so ago, that they were publishing the account of their findings, and this was a 6 or 7 year investigation undertaken by the professor, and it's appearing in the next journal of the Columbia Law Review. But it goes to, well, I guess it goes right back to Justice Scalia and his comment not too long ago that no one has ever proved that an innocent person has been executed. What they found in Texas, that indeed an innocent man had been executed. Not only did they find that the innocent guy had been executed, they also found that the judge, that the police, and that the prosecutor had been told that there was another person who was actually responsible for the murder. And they did nothing. And all the time it took to bring this innocent person to trial, to win a conviction, and ultimately to put him to death, nobody bothered to look at this other individual who they discovered later on had actually done the deed. We keep spending more time, more money to lock up people, but we remain fearful for our personal safety. In the welter of confusion with the lives and well-being of millions of citizens at risk, we are haphazardly creating a carceral state that threatens our deepest sense of humanity and raises some fundamental questions at the same time. What is it we hope to accomplish through this, I say, $60 billion a year operation? It's much higher than that now, that some say has spawned a self-serving prison industrial complex. How does the function of this system benefit society, truly? What does it say about our approach when we commit billions of second chance dollars to addressing obstacles created or exacerbated by the penal system while virtually ignoring the conditions that lead to criminal behavior in the first place? We move the mentally ill out of treatment settings and into our prisons. And I was just sitting in on the session where I think they actually had a better chart than this. But the point of this chart is to show that as people came out of the mental hospitals when they closed them, they wound up going into the prison system, almost one for one. It was almost a one-for-one shift between the two. We're adopting laws that keep formerly incarcerated individuals from living, working, and even passing through many parts of our cities and communities. And like the convict labor laws of the Reconstruction era, we're imposing oppressive fines and fees that make it almost impossible for formerly incarcerated men and women to establish law-abiding lives once they are released. The ineptness of dealing with these conflicting issues paints a grim picture of the underside of the carceral state, the side that we never intended, and the side so infrequently considered by the public. How did we as a society in search of the good life become so passionately punitive? Under constant pressure from diverse interests through the years, the criminal justice system has been tugged to and fro to accommodate vain searches for quick fixes of politicians, the emotions of crime victims, and the self-interest of vendors and suppliers. And the overlay on all this is a justice system built on legal technicalities that ignores the fundamental concept of fairness. We applaud the Supreme Court for exempting the mentally ill and juveniles from the death penalty. At the same time, however, we're willing to execute others who have endured extraordinary social deprivation, not just abject poverty, but lives devoid of opportunities, purposefulness, and moral sensibility. The self-evident truth that all men are created equal has been diminished by the disparities inherent in prosecution, sentencing, and lawmaking. Here's a couple of examples. Correcting that blatant inequity in the uneven punishments for the use of crack versus powdered cocaine has been a years-long proposition. We've been struggling with this for so long, and that issue here, of course, is a different way we treat offenders who are white or black. Crack, of course, being the drug of choice in inner city neighborhoods, and powdered cocaine being used more in more affluent suburbs. And after years of discussion and debate, Congress finally agreed to lower this disparity of crack sentences, which had been 100 times more severe for crack than for powdered cocaine, and they lowered it to 18 to 1. What a big improvement. But why not 1 for 1? I mean, what are we really doing here? Some states continue to sentence children to life without the possibility of parole, after all other nations of the world have banned the practice. And I'm sorry to say that right here in Pennsylvania, we have almost 500 men and women serving life without the possibility of parole for crimes they committed as juveniles, some as young as 14 years of age. One who was almost brought to adult court for a crime he committed at the age of 11. In fact, we have more of these juvenile lifers here in Pennsylvania than any other state, and more than any other jurisdiction anywhere in the world. I want to tell you about one case in particular. And this is a case that was written up in The Nation magazine in the last issue, I believe. The woman's name was Trina Garnett. Trina was 9 years old when her mother died. She had a low IQ and mental health problems in addition, and was being treated at Allentown State Hospital. She got released despite the objection of the doctor who had been treating her, was sent back home to live where she lived with her sister and other siblings. She stopped taking her meds. And she lived in the city of Chester, outside of Philadelphia. And one evening, she and a friend of hers broke into the home of another friend, and they were in the dark and they were lighting matches trying to find their way through the house. And of course, they lit the match and then they dropped it when it started to burn. Well, the house caught fire. The house burned down and 2 people were killed. Trina went on trial for homicide, arson, conspiracy, and robbery at the age of 14. She was convicted on the testimony of the girl who was with her. She got to the women's, the women's prison at Muncie, where she was raped by a correctional officer, became pregnant, had a son, and of course the son was then sent back home to live with Trina's sister. That was in 1977. I saw Trina about 6 months ago. She came into the room, a visiting room there at Muncie, in a wheelchair. She now has MS. And she wanted to apply for a commutation of her sentence. In Pennsylvania, all life sentences are life without the possibility of parole. So the only possibility of getting out is through the commutation process. And I haven't been in this business long enough to see a woman's sentence be commuted. I've only seen just a handful of men. But the thought struck me, because as much as I wanted to see this commutation process work, the thought struck me, what would this woman do at this point in her life, after having spent so many years in prison, after having so many needs, and now, you know, MS, she could hardly walk. I said, how would you support yourself? Oh, I can get a job at McDonald's. I don't think so. Well, unfortunately, I have to say, I don't think she's going to worry, because we don't commute people here. We do not commute very many sentences in this state. In addition to the juvenile life without parole, we impose long mandatory sentences for minor or coincidental involvement in crimes, an act that I believe displays a depth of our obsession with punishment. Felony homicide convictions mean thousands of men and women are serving sentences we used to reserve for cold-blooded killers, although they are, in many cases, unwitting accomplices, and in some cases, just along for the ride when a murder takes place. I'm reminded of a story not untypical of many, of 2 people I know. I'll call them Frank and Blanche. They were once young like the rest of us. They were in love and had decided to build a life together. Frank already had 2 children by another woman. So one day, Frank and Blanche picked up the 2 children, 2 sons, put them in the back of the car, and they were about to depart, and Frank said he wanted to tell the children's mother that he had the kids and he was taking them with them. So they stopped outside. Blanche waited in the car. Frank went inside, came out a short while later, and they drove off. 3 days later, they were arrested and charged with the murder of the children's mother. It appears Frank and the mother got into an argument. He hit her. She fell and hit her head and died. Blanche That's how quickly it happens. Blanche had no idea. She didn't have any clue about what happened upstairs. But she was charged as an accomplice because she was watching the kids while she was the getaway driver, basically. And she had nothing to trade, which is what often happens. The person who is on the outside and doesn't really know what went on has no real evidence that he can trade with the DA in order to get a later sentence. So they both got convicted, and both of them are in prison today. One's at Muncie, one's at Graterford. And, you know, they'll be there the rest of their lives. The weight of this harsh system has fallen on the most vulnerable and marginalized members of our society. The poor, the weak, the unskilled, the mentally ill, the undereducated, and of course, minorities. And once these people get caught up in this system, they often seem to be trapped in an endless cycle of incarceration because it becomes increasingly difficult for them to get their lives on an even keel. Those who most want to live law-abiding lives often face the most difficult obstacles. Oppressive financial burdens from fines and restitution, barriers to employment, and increasingly those prohibitions on where they can live, where they can work, and even where they can visit. Willie Weish is one other sad story that I want to share with you. Last summer in Philadelphia, the newspapers were full of headlines about the Society Hill Strangler. It seemed that women were accosted when walking alone in the Society Hill section after dark. They were accosted from behind, choked, and as they passed out, their purses were taken and the money was removed and the purse was dropped. There were 6 of these incidents that occurred. And after the 6th one, Willie Weish showed up at police headquarters and confessed to the crimes. He confessed that he did them. He said he didn't want to hurt anybody. He just needed the money. He needed the money because he had to pay rent to his aunt, some $200 and some a week, I believe. Willie Weish starts out as a child growing up in a project in South Philadelphia. He lives there with his mother, a brother, and a half-brother. The mother frequently, apparently, left home for days at a time, never leaving food, never leaving money. The boys were left there to fend for themselves. They fended by learning how to survive, and basically they learned how to survive by stealing money, stealing food, stealing what they needed in order to live. By the time Willie, who had an IQ of 74, by the time he hit 9th grade, he dropped out of school, and by the time he turned 19, he went on trial for a string of robberies. This is not the Society Hill ones, these are earlier robberies. He was convicted and sentenced to 6 to 20 years in the state prison. And when he went in and was classified, the counselors said, and this was all written out on the forms when he arrived, that he needed to do 3 things. He needed to take a drug treatment program because he'd been using marijuana and drinking. He needed to get a GED, and he needed to learn a job skill. Willie served every day of that 20-year, 6 to 20-year sentence, every day. And he was discharged, and when he came out, he started using methamphetamines. He did not have a GED, and he had no job skills. And within a week, he started his career as the Society Hill Strangler. Now, I believe, I mean, Willie hurt one woman. I mean, he traumatized all of them, to be sure. And I don't mean to overlook that. But one woman, I guess, had some damage to her throat. But he would choke them until they blacked out, and then, because he didn't want them to see him. At his trial, the only thing he could say in his defense, and I thought it was meaningful, was he turned around and addressed the victims and apologized. He said he was very sorry. He did not mean to hurt anybody. He just had to have money to live. So he was convicted and sentenced to 50 to 100 years. Here's a guy who is 40 years old and has spent half of his life in prison, and now he's got a sentence of 50 to 100 years to serve. Amazing. Some argue that men and women who go to jail are people who commit the most crimes, but that ignores the reality of how our system works. Police stage more raids in the poor inner city neighborhoods than they do in wealthier suburban communities. In cities, drugs are sold on street corners where it's a lot easier for police to monitor activities and make arrests. And once arrested, there aren't many poor folks who can afford a legal dream team. In fact, many go to trial with incompetent counsel. It's also an established fact that prosecutors use their discretion in filing charges, charges that result in people of color getting longer mandatory sentences than others. The numbers are astounding. In 1993 in South Africa, the incarceration rate for black men was 851 per 100,000. In 2006 in the United States, the incarceration rate for black men was almost 5,000 per 100,000. Look at the difference, from 851 to 4,900. Substantial racial and ethnic disparities exist in virtually all jurisdictions in the United States, and they occur at all levels as well, from arrest through prosecution, conviction, incarceration, and eventually parole. Of all men 18 and older in prisons, 1 in 106 is white, 1 in 36 Hispanic, and 1 in 15 is black. I'll just leave these for a minute because these numbers are, I always find them difficult to comprehend, but I think you can see that there's dramatic differences based on race, whether we're talking about men or women. Almost all of the women in prison were physically or emotionally abused at one time or another, and 1 out of 3, almost 33%, are diagnosed with some form of mental illness. And adding to the devastation of imprisonment, about 3/4 of all incarcerated women have children of school age or younger. And with diminished parental supervision, these youngsters are at increased risk of winding up in the penal system also. The penitentiary, as we know it today, was originally considered to be a humane institution. Although conditions in many of these facilities were horrid, they represented that new concept of punishing wrongdoers by confining them, that novel idea that took the place of corporal punishment, which had been the order of the day. But if most modern prisons eliminated physical torture, they actually heightened mental and emotional suffering in many ways, including through long mandatory sentences, confinement far from home, and overcrowding. Prisons are incredibly wasteful because they produce nothing of value. Not even, given the high rates of recidivism, not even a true sense of security. In fact, they actually destroy the human potential of millions of men and women who are confined. Some say prisons also serve as schools for learning the criminal trade and places where antisocial attitudes are hardened. Although 9 out of 10 prisoners eventually return to society, many come back with obsolete or no marketable job skills, no families or caring social networks, huge debts, and harsh parole restrictions. Prisons are soaking up increasing shares of state budgets and replacing the spending priority we once put on higher education. In fact, the Department of Corrections in Pennsylvania now gets one of the largest appropriations in the state. The annual budget is about $1.8 billion for the operation of the state prison system. But that doesn't include the cost of the counties to run their jails, nor does it include the hundreds of millions of dollars that are allocated for the construction of additional prisons, and build we must because of the number of people we're confining. We have 3 new prisons being built in Pennsylvania today. I know Secretary Wetzel talks about the fact that one prison was scrapped. There were 4 that were scheduled. So one was scrapped, but we're building 3 new ones. In addition to the financial burden, though, prisons also create additional difficulties in our communities. For instance, in many inner-city neighborhoods, large numbers of men are in prison, and there are few positive role models for the children. In these desolate communities where schools, public services, and housing are substandard and legitimate job prospects are virtually non-existent, many young boys grow up to become drug dealers and gangsters as a means to survive. Social capital disappears, and crime, poverty, and an outlaw culture thrive. Furthermore, the disenfranchisement of thousands of formerly incarcerated men and women is another devastating blow. More than 13% of adult black men are prohibited from voting because of a felony conviction. This in a land where former prisoners, like the esteemed William Penn and others, once fled to for freedom. Moreover, the loss of voting rights and concurrent shifting of representation from urban areas where most crimes occur to rural communities where most prisons are sited creates a distorted picture of our democracy, because voting power goes with the population and the prisoners are counted as population in the communities where they're held, even though they can't vote. It also causes important revenue-sharing monies to go to those sparsely populated rural communities and to bypass the urban neighborhoods that are in desperate need of such support. In SCI Forest in west central Pennsylvania opened, 5 or 6 years ago, and the day that it opened, the county population doubled. That meant more money and more representation in a very sparse area. While we like to consider America as an inclusive melting pot, we are systematically making sure that the points of view of identifiable segments of our society are clearly excluded. There's little doubt that prisons in the United States are being overused, but it's not happening because of increases in crime. In fact, the crime rate has been coming down for the last 2 decades. Instead, this over-reliance on incarceration results from poor policy choices and a penchant to punish. We don't need to be trapped in this gloomy situation. There is a more positive strategy that needs to be considered. We need to take a more corrective approach that diverts citizens into programs that address their needs for better vocational guidance to lift them out of poverty, for treatment to deal with chemical dependencies, and for care for those with mental illnesses, given how significantly these issues affect both the system and society. We should develop a First Chance initiative that provides opportunities so that all citizens can share in the promise of a decent and secure future. And we have to remind ourselves that the loss of liberty suffered by someone who's imprisoned is punishment enough. There's no need to create additional sanctions that make it virtually impossible for 2 out of 3 formerly incarcerated men and women to successfully re-enter society. I think most of all, we need to think clearly about society's long-term interests. We actually, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself, but these were a few things that we thought were strategies that might be considered. We really need to think about society's best long-term interest, not the sexiest soundbite or the quickest fix that has driven us in an eye-for-an-eye fashion. In an eye-for-an-eye world, offenders and punishers become twins. Offenders commit crimes to fit in with their peers, to feed their families, and at times to sate those uncontrollable demons in their minds. Punishers punish to express moral outrage and reinforce social order, to earn a paycheck, and too often to even scores. There ought to be a third leg on the stool, one that protects all of us from future harms while using the power, the intelligence, and the humaneness, the most exalted virtues we possess, to help bring the most disadvantaged members of our society into a safe and secure life. That may seem like a novel approach, but it's nothing more than the fairness and compassion for all people that we would expect for ourselves and our loved ones. So this long march of justice has taken us from periods of gruesome physical penalties to more sanitized but no less deadly punishments. In recent years, we've been waltzing with legalities, always trying to explain away our desire to punish behind a smokescreen of legal mumbo-jumbo and faux concern for victims. As advocates, we are driven by a vision that sees justice as a positive force, one that corrects man's missteps, not one committed to vengeance, revenge, and retribution. Up to now, our progress has been measured at a snail's pace. But as I said before, the world is shrinking and things are happening faster. Electronic keystrokes work wonders. It could be that we have reached the darkest point of night before the dawn, that we have tired of physical brutality, torture, and intellectual nonsense. It could just be that this long evolutionary march of justice is taking us to a point where compassion and fairness soon will be just a click away. Thank you. I guess we have time for...
Would you be willing to?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
The Second Chance Act requires that all grant applicants use evidence-based responses. Are you making a radical suggestion that our response to crime up front be evidence-based?
Why not? You know, I'll tell you, in the time that I've been involved in this, it seems like we get so caught up in these little catchphrases. I mean, there's also something called common sense, which is not evidence-based. It's just there. And I think we know it when we see it. I'm not saying that evidence-based practices shouldn't be considered and aren't good on their own, but I think that there's more to this game than just that. Anyone else? Ma'am.
I can't remember if it was in the Atlantic or the New Yorker. There was an article about that we don't understand what justice is in our country because we focus so much on the technicalities that we look at, did they get a fair trial? Did they follow the rules? Did they? And the overall point of justice is missed. It seemed a pretty reasonable argument to me that we lose the big picture because we get caught up in what everybody calls the technicalities.
It seems like a very reasonable argument to me. I mean, I believe we were just in a session, another session, and I didn't mention it there because I always have these flaky ideas about how we could make improvements, like, you know, we're putting too many people in prison. That's the problem. It's not finding a way to, you know, some distorted way of dealing with the fact after the fact. In this state, our sentencing schemes are minimum and maximum, the minimum being half of the maximum sentence. So when you've served your minimum, then you're eligible for parole, and you can be on parole until such time as your maximum time is expired. And so, you know, we're talking about sentences of 5 to 10 years, 10 to 20. And I'm thinking to myself, why don't we have, instead of having them half, why don't we have 25%? So that, or even 10%. I mean, you know, the value of incarceration occurs early on in the first few months. After that, it's just on and on, you know, it's constant boredom. And then you start getting into situations where people are learning criminal trades. They are learning, you know, we have studies that have shown that if you put nonviolent offenders in with violent offenders for a long time, they become violent. Well, we shouldn't want that. We should want to be able, you know, when we have to correct our children because they run out in the middle of the street without looking, you know, we don't look to confine them for the rest of their life. You know, we want to make sure that they learn a lesson from it. We don't teach lessons in our prisons. We have bought into this false argument that if we punish them long enough, they'll learn the lesson. Well, that's just not working. That's not happening. And that's why we have such huge recidivism rates. So people just cycle right back into the prison. So. Yes, ma'am.
If people know what the problem is, why aren't they doing anything?
No. That's the question of the day. Well, they don't because, I believe it's because of politics.
Yes.
You know, I mean, after Willie Horton, you know, who was going to commute anybody's sentence? You could see all across the country. I mean, we think we have a terrible system in Pennsylvania, but it's no different anywhere else in the country. I just got an advanced copy of a book that was written by a reporter in California who covered the story of 5 lifers. Now, in California, they have many more life sentence prisoners than we have in Pennsylvania, but most of them are serving life with the possibility of parole. So what do? People come up for parole. Charlie Manson, every year he comes up before the parole board, and they knock him down. But what was happening in this book was these 5 people would come up for parole, and they might get a hit or something, and they would get sent back, and then they would come back the next year, and eventually the parole board would say, okay, they're suitable for parole. And then the governor had a 150-day period to review that, and during that 150 days, he could reverse it. He was reversing all of them, and it wasn't just one. It was Gray Davis, it was Arnold Schwarzenegger. I mean, it didn't matter what party they were from. They are elected officials, and they do not want to be considered to be soft on crime. And that's, you know, that's why we go through all these contortions. When I started, one of the first things that I worked on when I started dealing with this stuff was alternatives to incarceration. You know, we have low-level, nonviolent people. Instead of putting them in prison, let's put them in house arrest. Let's give them electronic monitors. Let's do anything we can do to keep them out of prison. No, we don't like that. We don't like the terminology. Alternatives to incarceration means we're letting them get away with something. So we don't want to do that. Well, we have been fighting with that for years. After so many years, they decided, well, instead of doing alternatives, let's call it intermediate punishment. Yeah, okay, well, we can buy that. So they started doing intermediate punishments, and that really didn't do it. But now what we're doing is we're developing specialty courts. So now we have veterans courts, we have mental health courts, we have drug courts. We have all these specialty courts, which are basically alternatives to incarceration.
Thank you.
Only you go before the judge, and the judge says, okay, you have to go see this therapist. So now we can hang the judge if something goes wrong, right? I mean, it's ridiculous. We play these silly games with ourselves, and I think the reason is that, well, you know, what do they say? Let's look in the mirror. What do we do? What are we doing to change the people that we have put into office? We've got them so scared to death that they're going to get voted out of office. A couple of years ago, a guy was released, Daniel Giddings was his name. He was released from prison. He was doing a 6 to 12-year sentence. He served 10 years, and they released him. He came out, and he wound up, a police officer was chasing him. Wanted to do a car stop. The guy ran. The cop chased him. The guy wound up shooting the policeman. There was such a hue and cry about this parolee who shot the cop that the governor then turned around and declared a moratorium on parole. So for a matter of months, until the absurdity of what he had done sunk in, nobody got out unless they maxed out. All of a sudden, the population in Pennsylvania spiked. I mean, other states were doing things to get rid of population. Our population was going gangbusters. And we have not gotten over it yet. That's why they were going to build 4 new prisons. So they finally decided, no, we'll squeeze everybody into 3 new prisons, and eventually this will work its way out. The warden from Graterford Prison, which is our biggest maximum security prison, recently retired. He's on our board of directors now. And we were having dinner the other night, and he said, you know, my deputy used to be he was a cop for years, and he retired from the police force, and then he came to work in security at the prison. And he always said, you know why former prisoners shoot policemen? No, why? He said, because they chase them. He said, let him go. We know where he's going. We know where he lives. We can go arrest him later. But, you know, in the heat of the moment, things kind of escalate. Well, what can I tell you? It's a crazy, crazy scene. Yes, yes, sir.
Whenever I take a journey through this whole thing like we've just gone through again, one of the greatest distinctions that I think I've ever really embraced is the distinction between what is natural and what is artificial. When people walk up to an artificial flower, very often they'll say, is it real? I still have to catch myself. Of course it's real, but it's artificial. When people talk about the real world, they're talking about economy, government, and the courts, the justice system. Of course it's real, but so is our God-given lives where we need intimacy and relationships. Now I call that natural. It's real and natural. And very often I hear good people myself and good people here, you know, asking, why can't something artificial be more natural? Well, it could be more natural, but it's still going to be artificial. So let's try to change it, but remember that it's an artificial game that we have created. Thank God we got it. It beats shootouts and lynch mobs. But let's try to make it better, but remember always, it's just an artificial game that we have created as a shortcut to true love and relationships and intimacy. Until we learn that, we're going to deal with something that is really flawed and is just not that good. We shouldn't be killing people because of something, you know, something that's not that good, came up with some cockamamie conclusion about somebody. So that's just an observation I have.
Thank you. Your observation reminds me of something that I'd like to share with you. A few years back, a colleague of mine and I were down at the prison down in Chester, and we were running a little program, National Issues Forums program. The Kettering Foundation out in Ohio has sponsored this for years, and not for the prisons, for communities, general communities. And they develop these issue books around topics that are of concern to the general public. Topics about child raising, the economy, whatever, terrorism, crime. And so we were trying to teach prisoners how to moderate small groups. And because we had hoped that then they would be able to run these groups inside the prison and have really civil discourse, discussions like they might have on the outside. Well, maybe not like they used to have on the outside, but the kind that we had hoped they might have on the outside. So we had just come back from lunch, and people were sort of filtering in the room, and there was one guy there who was Hispanic, had these teardrop tattoos coming down his cheek, looking pretty, macho. And he said, you know, there's something that I always wanted and could never get. I never understood. And I said, well, what's that? He said, you know, when you go to a fancy restaurant and they have all these spoons and forks, he said, I never know which one to use first. And I thought, where is this thing going? And he said, nobody ever told me anything about that. And I always wondered about that. So I said, you're talking about etiquette. You know, we wound up buying an Emily Post book to put in the prison library. I was just flabbergasted. A couple of years ago, in a different prison, different setting, different people, I heard almost the same identical thing from another guy, life sentence prisoner. I think there's such a hunger from a lot of these people just to feel like they are part of a society. And this is sort of the entrance examination, you know? Which fork do I use first?
Yes.
Nobody tells me what I need to know to really get in on the inside. It's true. I mean, in the back.
I'm the founder of Occupy Wall Street, and this is part of my research. So basically, I think you're saying to this audience here today is that the system's broken.
Yep.
The system is broken.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
That's a valid conclusion.
Well, I think what I'm trying to say is this. It certainly is broken. But I can't do my job without some sense of optimism or something that's going to drive me to go to work tomorrow, because otherwise I would shoot myself or something. The system is awful. But I believe that it is making progress. And I think we are heading in a right direction. Now, the timing is what it's all about. I mean, it's taken us how long to go from boiling somebody in a big pot of oil, to lethal injection, for God's sake.
If you could be a visionary, how would you paint the future of what you would like to see?
Well, I think we need places to control some folks. I think some people are really in such need of that we have to have those places. Do they need to look like prisons? I don't think so. I think we could probably let half of the people out of prison tomorrow and not even realize any difference in our lifestyle. And I work with these folks. We have them in our office every day. We're doing reentry programs. I think that we as a society need to become a lot more sophisticated. Things they do in Europe that we poo-poo all the time. Well, we don't want to be like them. In the Scandinavian countries, people go home on the weekend, they report back, they go to work, they come back in at night. Those countries are civilized societies. They're doing pretty well for themselves. They're not the macho kinds of guys that we are here in this country, with all of our guns and whatnot. But they're getting along just fine. And I think we need to move more in that kind of a direction.
Well, we're a people-based organization. And if you had a position paper, if you could provide it to us, I think that would be a start, because really we're about getting things done. It's really, if you could paint the picture for what you'd want to see, because as with medical, there's other countries in the world that have better medical systems than us.
Absolutely.
And we're America. We should be number one at all these things. And
we're number one for those that can afford it.
Thank you.
well, yeah, we've addressed that issue.
All right?
Yeah, Bill. Last month, I happened to visit 4 prisons in Europe, and one of the things that struck me, I agree with you about, it's totally different over there, and we don't usually do what they do, but one of the things that struck me is it's apples and oranges. Those prisons, again, I went to 4 in one country, 3 in one country, 1 in the other, and the size of the prisons is so much different. You're talking about prisons of 250 to 500 maximum, right? So even though I agree with you that we could adopt more things like the Scandinavian countries, which have the best prisons in the world. I've been in a couple of them. It's apples and oranges. You deal with Graterford, has more inmates than the entire countries. So I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. I'm just saying in perspective, but sometimes we forget the size difference. It's so significant that it's apples and oranges. But what I really wanted to say was, what always confused me or concerns me is this issue of looking at every individual and their case and their problems and their sentence and whatever, and the issue of justice. Because, I'd like to think about everybody's different, but when you have such a big system, like I just mentioned, you have such many problems and so many people and so many criminals, whatever, it's difficult to look at every individual and treat them, and yet still retain justice. And I go back to the 80s or so, when both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, both went to sentencing, structured sentencing, reducing sentencing disparities, and things like this, to reduce the problem, what I'm getting at here, the problem between individual problems and justice. So again, I'm frustrated with us. I'm asking, you touched on it here, this difference between efficiency and justice. So how do we solve this problem? You want to deal with individual problems, but at the same time, you have the issue of equity. You have the issue of complexity of, 2.3 million people. So I don't know if you can touch a little bit on the complexity of that, and what do you suggest to deal with it? Because I'm sympathetic with what you're saying, but at the same time, it's very complex.
I agree.
No, I don't know the answer.
You're right. You're right. Look, one of the reasons we're having the problems we're having with our system today is because I think we have gone for simplistic responses much too often. We try, the flavor of the day, and we keep shifting gears. now it's justice reinvestment. I still am, I mean, I hope it works, but I'm still hoping that alternatives to incarceration are going to work. And I think maybe we're going to see some benefit from the specialty courts. But I think we have an inclination to want to come in with a quick answer. We can't, and obviously the situation is much different. It's a much bigger country. Look at how many people we have in this country. But of course, we keep criminalizing stuff too. We keep writing laws because we have too many legislators, and the legislators, that's what they do. They write laws. And we have a legal system that just won't quit. And I think that the legal system, to my mind, sorry, my apologies to all the lawyers. But I mean, I think there's a real problem where we try to play these games. I use that term legal mumbo jumbo. I really meant that.
Oh, you did.
I think we are so full of legal mumbo jumbo that we create more problems than we solve. I mean, there's some basic questions of fairness and how we're going to treat people, which ought to be, I think, a primary concern, and I don't think it is. So.
We talk about the corporations today and how they're so dominant, and you really only you do is you have to break them up.
Yeah.
The prison industrial complex has become a corporation. It's an empire in itself. And the only way you're going to break it up is to go in and break it up and retrain some of the people that are in there to be more humane and a different system. Because that's so powerful. It's connected with so many different entities, corporations, the judges, the corporation people, the unions. It's a mammoth monolith. And it has to be broken up, and it's not working. And the people who work there know it's not working, because all this rest, it's mostly all built on punishment. And a lot of the people who work there every day see it, and they're dehumanized too, because people aren't given respect. They're not given respect at all. And that creates a lot of damage and a lot of violence. So I think it's personal, and it has to be an intervention from some entity. I think that the religious institutions have to take the lead on this.
I think it is that punitive bent that we have on everything that we do. I mean, I think, correctional officers used to teach classes in the prison. It wasn't that long ago. They were the teachers. And, there's a bond between the teacher and the student. And then at some point, they said, oh, they're getting too close. So we have to take them out of the picture, and let's hire teachers to teach, and the guards can guard. And I think you don't teach people etiquette that way. No. You don't teach them what they really need. I mean, those folks really need that touch of humanity. We have, we have the sociopaths, we have the psychopaths, we have those people that you're not going to maybe reach in a hurry, but we have a lot of people who just need some basics. Respect.
Would you be willing to address the issue of plea bargaining and bail as far as how many people we put in at the entry level?
Well, I mean, we've got 90% of the cases are done through plea bargaining. A young woman in my office, a relative of hers was on trial this week. He's implicated in a crime in which somebody was killed. He was not the shooter. He was a lookout somewhere. And they offered him a deal. They offered him, 17 to 35 years? So I'm not taking that. I didn't do it. I didn't shoot anybody. I'm not taking it. Well, guess what? The guy who did the shooting had already cut his deal, and he was going to finger this guy. This guy was going to get a life sentence. And he's looking at it and saying, this is my day in court, and I didn't do it, so they're going to acquit me. Guess what? They're not going to acquit him. He'll be there for the rest of his life. Now, and he's a young guy. I mean, young, 17 years? I can say that, Well, not now. There was a time when I could have said it. But doing 17 years, I mean, people do reach that point and they get out.
I'm way over here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just coming over there.
you know, I just want to say there's such a lack of will. Such a lack of will in this society and in our faith-based communities to tell the truth and to take on and controversy, like war, like prisons, like all those really important things in our society. And I really find a strong lack of will.
One of our policy director, the wonderful young woman named Ann Schwartzman, who's been doing this for a number of years, and she made me promise to mention to you folks something that was talked about years ago and we never bothered to implement, but we may try it soon. And it's called Prison Sabbath. Prison Sabbath. And it was an attempt to connect with the faith community and designate a day, you know, maybe a year away or 6 months or whatever we felt we could do, where we could, excuse me, we could put together some fact sheets and create a focus on criminal justice and distribute those materials throughout the community so that we could hear sermons and talks and whatnot in our religious communities. It may be something that some of you folks want to think about.
Just to follow up, I've said it here several times, but the most neglected work of mercy is visiting the incarcerated, and the works of mercy are not a multiple choice.
Thank you. Yeah, Jim.
People here have heard me rail against the use of the term criminal justice system when get tough on crime type legislators can enact stuff with no accountability. I'd like to see, do you think there's any hope for like focusing on public safety to include pre-sentencing and re-entry and the whole sphere of it?
I'm sorry, I don't get the question, Jim.
Getting people to stop less about the criminal justice system, which is very narrow,
And talk more about
judicial
safety.
system, and the broader term of public safety that includes re-entry. I happen to be a re-entry freak, and to me, you know, successful re-entry means less crime, more taxpayers, what's not to like. But it gets short shrift because we're too busy locking people up.
Well, yes, I agree. We never talk about the front end, about why are we locking up so many people at the front end. If we address that question, if we shorten sentences, Pew just came out with a report the other day, new report on length of confinement. It turns out, and this was 2009 statistics, Michigan had the highest average rate of confinement. It was 4-point-something years. Pennsylvania was second at 3.8 years. It's online. You can go online, the Pew Center for the States, and they have separate fact sheets for each state, so you can look up the situation in your state. But we are, you know, we think that if we just make sentences longer, we're going to make things better.
It's
doesn't work that way.
Because they always get out, and that's what the legislature think about.
It's revenge.
Magical thing.
It's revenge.
Well, that has a lot to do with it, certainly. Ma'am.
I have to make one comment. If you've ever, I've been a landlord in the inner city. And I've got a little thing I constantly remind myself of, and that's if you've never had a table and you've never sat down to eat at a table, and you've never had any community around that table, like parents or children or anything, you have no understanding. I mean, I can understand your fork thing because you don't learn the things that, like, for instance, I learned in my life when we at least had to sit down at a table. Mm-hmm. So it is so minuscule what people don't know that they don't even know the consequences of they don't even know how to process behavior. The people, many of the people that I come across, because they don't even understand that there are consequences for all of their choices at every choice point and whatnot, where a parent corrects you. But if you're so impoverished that there's nobody ever home to help you with anything, they don't get any of those building blocks. And I like that book, because how would you know to start over here and move to the right if you had never even had a table?
Yeah, Bill, you've talked about this in previous discussions we've had about this concept that it's difficult to rehabilitate somebody if they haven't been habilitated.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with people, and I think I've talked to enough people here about the importance of just family. You know, I mean, people ask me, well, what do you think about crime? I say, well, I think it's a family problem. And they look at me and think, but I mean, if you don't deal with it from day one, you're gonna, and this is what the people you're dealing with and we're dealing with. But I mean, not to try to simplify it, it's very complicated. But last question, last thought. Sorry, just wait. Last one.
The problem is though, by the time they get into the prison system, it's too late for that.
Right.
You know, that first rehabilitation.
Well, I'll tell you, there's a guy, a lifer, who was commuted about a year ago in Pennsylvania, Tyrone Wirtz. He was one of, I think he had 8 or 9 children in his family. Both parents worked, they were straight arrow people. All these other kids grew up, ministers, good solid citizens. All of them raising good families. And he was a cowboy. And he always said, I love the life. The life is the expression, life on the street.
Right.
And he was fascinated by it. He got caught up with his friends and wound up, they were out to rob they were going to rob drug dealers.
Try that.
Somebody, well, it's Robin Hood, you know. Anyway, somebody got shot and died, and so a bunch of them got life sentences. And he's a very charismatic character. In fact, right now, he got out a year ago. He is now working part-time as a counselor for the Defenders Association of Philadelphia as a mediation counselor, and part-time for the Inside Out program. Mm-hmm. Anybody ever hear of that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, he's one of their big salesmen.
We tried to get them, but they couldn't.
I'm a forensic chaplain at SCI Waymart, a forensic unit, and I think we're on to something when we talk about the family and the fragmentation of the family. I've been there for 27 years, and I'm part of the treatment team, and I do assessments and interviews on the most horrific ones that they can't handle, like say they can't handle in a SCI retreat or Greaterford. At their mental health unit, they send them to us for treatment, intense treatment. There's something that's sort of, they have identifiable with in the interviews that I've done. One, they all, 99% of them come from broken families. Father's Day is coming around the corner. They have no concept of this idea of, honor your father or love your father. Chances are that they've been abused by their father. Chances are that they don't have a father in their life. The brokenness is beyond my concept, beyond my understanding. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse. That's by the time they're 9, 10 years old. And their whole persona has been formed in this broken icon of humanity. So I think our incarceration sort of begins already at that level, and they don't realize how they are incarcerated in many ways. They become victims, and they don't know it. And what I like about your presentation, you approach it statistically, but then at the same time, you approach it not from your mind, but from your heart. And I think that's the way we have to view this from our hearts and realize that we all have a journey. And the longest journey in life has the shortest distance, from the mind to the heart. Longest journey, shortest distance, but to get there is difficult. And it took me sitting there for years and years and years, listening to the interviews. I was a son of immigrant parents from Eastern Europe. I took for granted that every mother makes chicken noodle soup for the son and says, what do you want for lunch? And make sure that my clothes are clean and my linen is washed. And I took all that for granted. And I love to tell this story. I'm doing number 3,000 interviews. And I'm going home to see mom and dad. And my dad died about 6 years ago. And I'm a priest. And I never actually thanked my mom and dad for giving me a beautiful life that I didn't realize I had growing up. So that day, I went to visit mom and dad. It was Thanksgiving with my family. And I said to my mother, I want to talk to you privately. My mom said, Johnny's probably sick. He wants to talk to you. No. I said, Mom, Johnny wants to thank you for a beautiful life that you've given me, that I took for granted and I didn't realize. Now, what drove me to that level of being a thankful person? Realizing story after story after story after story, the brokenness of our society, that we're incarcerating people who were never empowered, people who never had a chance in life, people who are broken, and then we put them away and we think we fix it. We don't fix it. We don't fix it. So I want to thank you for not so much for your statistics, but from your heart. And I think if more people had that, we can equip and fund and channel the money to these neighborhoods and build up the lives of these young people so they can become productive citizens of our country.
Thank you. Thank you. It's community building.
It is all about.
Really is the answer.
Okay. Well,
Okay.
we have to pay
I
him
guess-
overtime if he stays one more minute.
Thank you. Thank you all.
5:30 dinner? 5:30 dinner, sharp, so you can then go on to your escapade.
7 o'clock.